This week, anti-critical race theory has become a rallying cry for conservatives and self-styled free thinkers across the country, defining school board and governors' elections. The anti-CRT efforts have put teachers on edge and raises questions about the future of Holocaust education. Let's talk about it. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. Before jumping in, if you like this podcast or Jewfolk generally and the work that we do, support us by buying our merch. A link to our Teespring store is available in the podcast notes. Also, Minnesota's 24-hour online give-a-thon, Give to the Max Day, is coming up on November 18th, but you can donate starting right now. If you enjoy podcasts like this one or any other content we produce, please visit givemn.org/organization/Jewfolk to donate. A link is in the podcast notes in case you don't feel like typing all of that. We appreciate any and all support. Okay, now to the main story. Anti-critical race theory. There's a lot that can be covered about this in terms of background, from what critical race theory actually is to the politics of the culture wars, but let's cut through that to simplify things, because in some sense, getting wrapped up in the broader details is counterproductive to understanding what's going on. If that sounds backwards to you, especially on this podcast where I'm often a stickler for detailed background, let me explain why I'm saying this. Anti-critical race theory has very little to actually do with the real academic framework called critical race theory. I can't explain to you what CRT is, and neither can the people who say they oppose it. For a good example of that, just revisit episode 52 of this podcast about California's ethnic studies controversy and a bad piece of reporting from Tablet magazine where the writer declared CRT to be the problem, but did not define it in any substantial way in the piece. CRT is not something that is taught in K-12 school systems where the people who oppose it say it is. It's not in state education guidelines or standards either, though the people who oppose CRT argue that it is. So spending time on the actual critical race theory here would be a distraction, because then you would think that CRT and anti-CRT are two equal sides of the same debate or something, and they're not. They're not related, other than CRT being sort of a placeholder for whatever the anti-CRT people deem evil. So let's instead talk about what the anti-critical race theory movement is, with a focus on some of the proposed and enacted legislation about K-12 education that claims to be anti-CRT. Because that's where the Jewish angle on this really comes up, most notably in regards to how these efforts and these laws can affect Holocaust education and teaching about anti-Semitism in schools. Here are some local Minnesota examples of what the anti-CRT movement likes to say, courtesy of various candidates for school boards during this recent election cycle on November 2nd. In Wayzata, quote, critical race theory is slowly being introduced to our kids, and many parents aren't aware of it. We need clear guidelines for faculty that materials are curriculum-based only, and that classrooms are not a place for politics or a platform for personal opinions. In Minnetonka, quote, social tensions are racing across our country and infiltrating our school districts. Each year, thousands of parents bring their kids to the Minnetonka School District because we have kept our focus on academics, not classroom activism. In Florida, back in June, the state's Board of Education banned critical race theory, and Governor Ron DeSantis said the ban would help students learn facts rather than indoctrinating them with ideology. So taking a step back, this emphasis on the alleged influence of politics in the classroom and focus on just the facts education is alluding to the conversation about systemic racism in America that has erupted since the murder of George Floyd last year. But it also has a more distinct target. The New York Times 1619 Project, a journalistic reflection on how slavery and white supremacy have defined the inner workings of the United States since African slaves first arrived in British American colonies 400 years ago. The 1619 Project has been explicitly banned from being taught in schools by a Texas anti-CRT law passed and signed earlier this year. And on that note, legislation, both passed and not passed, brings a little more clarity to what the anti-CRT crowd are actually trying to do in schools. The Texas law says that if a teacher discusses a, quote, particular current event or widely debated and currently controversial issue of public policy or social affairs, that teacher will strive to explore that topic from diverse and contending perspectives. A proposed but not passed Missouri bill aimed to ban divisive concepts, for example, the idea that the United States is fundamentally racist or sexist, and an attempted amendment to a Missouri omnibus bill would have banned curriculum that, quote, identifies people, entities, or institutions as inherently, immutably, or systemically sexist, racist, biased, privileged, or oppressed, or curriculum that assigns blame to categories of persons regardless of the actions of particular individuals. All of this to stop kids being taught about systemic racism and its legacy in the United States. And there are all sorts of problems with these anti-CRT laws and efforts. First of all, who defines what is or isn't a controversial issue that needs multiple perspectives? Second of all, for all the talk about, not being political and teaching just the facts, these requirements erase factual historical context and make facts all but meaningless. Many issues and historical events don't have legitimate multiple perspectives to teach and have been controversial in their time. And I hate to break it to you, but the United States does in fact have systemic racism that has defined the trajectory not only of this country, but entire world events. And teachers are ever more confused and scared of what they can or can't teach or say, because even though these laws aren't written with a clear way to be enforced, it gives an easy way for local school boards to discipline or fire teachers if a parent decides a subject is too controversial to be taught to their kid. But I know that, look, at face value, this is a lot of jargon to talk through about, CRT, anti-CRT, what's written in these laws, which, from a legal standpoint, is really vague. So let's get a little more direct about what these anti-CRT laws and efforts have the capability to do to Jewish, Holocaust, and anti-Semitism education in schools, and how Jewish history is a great way to understand how utterly bizarre this stuff is. Most prominently in Texas, the anti-CRT law resulted in one school district administrator telling teachers that if they had a book about the Holocaust, they should also have a book with an opposing or other perspective in order to be legally safe. There are people and parents who deny the Holocaust or want to minimize it, or might just feel particularly sensitive about such a brutal topic being discussed and taught about in schools. When it comes to anti-CRT laws, truly, what is to say that if a parent decides teaching about the Holocaust is controversial, that books or educational content don't get cut? In regards to the attempted Missouri legislation, there's a great op-ed in the St. Louis Jewish Light, linked to in the podcast notes, where Russell Neese, a Jewish educator, talks about how the anti-CRT legislation would unravel Holocaust education. Neese wrote about the proposed anti-CRT amendment that it, quote, suggests that it would be illegal for a teacher to say the Nazis murdered Jews, since after all, not all Nazis murdered Jews, and assigning blame to entire categories of persons based on the actions of particular individuals would be illegal. Under this law, it would be impossible to teach that Nazi Germany was inherently anti-Semitic, or that the Third Reich oppressed Jews simply because they were Jews, because that would identify Nazis as inherently biased and Jews as inherently and systemically oppressed. End quote. So the entire premise of this anti-CRT stuff undercuts a lot of education. And let's get into even gnarlier territory, because part of the claim for all this backlash against systemic racism being taught about in schools is that it makes America look bad. It's unpatriotic to say this country has an endemic and institutional problem with racism. Systemic racism is a political opinion, and we need to teach kids just the facts instead of indoctrinating them into hating America. Look, is it unpatriotic, and should it be illegal? to teach about the overwhelming racism and white supremacy of the early 20th century U.S. that pushed Congress to pass the Immigration Act of 1924, which massively reduced Jewish immigration and effectively shut the escape route for European Jews who were already facing increasing anti-Semitism and violence. Without that act, without institutional American racism and anti-Semitism that was rooted in legislation like the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 and the Naturalization Act of 1790, we could be talking to so many more of our relatives today. Instead, they were left to be murdered by the Nazis. Is it unpatriotic, and should it be illegal to teach that the Nazis took many of their cues about how to institute racial laws and legal discrimination and oppression from the United States? That this country's legacy was a direct contributor to the vile hatred that targeted minorities because it had already well institutionalized and legalized vile hatred that targeted minorities, from white supremacist race laws to an obsession with eugenics. The Texas Anti-CRT law bans teaching that, quote, an individual by virtue of the individual's race or sex bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. Do we not teach about Nazism and the Holocaust that Germans and other citizens of the Nazi regime absolutely have a responsibility for what happened? That even those who may not have been at the death camps or in the firing squads killing Jews, that they cannot escape accountability and pretend like they had no idea this was happening and that it's none of their business because some other guy did the dirty deed? Do we not teach never again as a concept that should apply to everyone, with all people bearing responsibility, to make sure such horrible things never happen again? Would all of that be banned as well? Politicians might twist themselves into not saying, no, we didn't mean for anti-CRT legislation to affect Holocaust education. But if you want the full context to the facts of historical events and issues, you can't have these kinds of laws. You can't have this blind movement about keeping out classroom activism and staying politically neutral or whatever. The United States is a country with so many elements and promises and ideals and deep, deep failures. To be an informed citizen, to be a better and well-educated person, all of it needs to be on the table, especially during formative educational years. But as panic against critical race theory spreads, how many more school boards and states will it inspire? How many laws will anti-CRT politicians and activists pass? Already 28 states have seen these kinds of efforts, which you can find more info about in the link to a Chalkbeat story in the podcast notes. And several school districts are reevaluating what books they have, functionally figuring out what books to try and ban. And one last thought on the Jewish connection to all this. Jews should be deeply worried about the anti-CRT movement, not only because it could cut down on Holocaust and anti-Semitism education, but there's a broader Jewish angle here because any effort to restrict how and if systemic racism can be taught in this country is an affront to the history of Black Jews, of Asian Jews, of Latino Jews, of all Jews who come from backgrounds that have been consistently targeted in this country. It's not just, we should stand up for our neighbors so their history and our history is accurately taught in the face of all this. As an American Jewish community, all of this is our history now, from the legacy of slavery and anti-Asian racism to the weaponized anti-Semitism of the 20th century. It doesn't mean we hate America to make sure that kids get the opportunity to learn about this country's issues. And it doesn't mean we want these kids to learn to hate America. But to end on a truly, a full-throated opinion, it can be hard nowadays to imagine the higher ideals of the United States. But I think the promise of this country is the ability to dream of better and to work to make it happen. But we don't dream of better by sticking our heads in the sand and trying to avoid serious problems because they make us feel bad or guilty or unpatriotic. We do so by learning what the issues are and then figuring out how to address them. That takes an honest education, something anti-CRT efforts do not and will not provide. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news stories or reports referenced for this episode.